So, before we get into the myths and the facts of the Wild West and the gunslingers and the outlaws and all that jazz, I want to start with sort of what started this all and what sort of kicked it off, and that's obviously westward expansion. So, I want to start off with this concept of manifest destiny, which is sort of the idea that it's America's destiny to expand all the way to the Pacific coast. And the idea of the American dream at this point. So, what is the concept of manifest destiny, and what was the idea of the American dream in the 19th century?
Well, manifest destiny is the idea that the United States was destined by God to stretch from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it came along at a very opportune time. It came along just before the outbreak of the U.S. Mexican War in 1846. And it was, you would see that as put forth as kind of a justification for the United States to be taking these lands from Mexico. Really, it's the entire American Southwest, and there's different motivations, and of course, politically, there were all kinds of concerns. Were they going to expand slavery into these new acquisitions, and that was a heated debate. And certainly, I think you had slave states and slave partisans that wanted to expand and find new areas for that system or that institution. But anyway, as far as the American dream, I it's just like you find with Henry David Thoreau. Westward I go free. It's this idea: if you go west, you have the opportunity for a new life. You can advance yourself and make yourself better. You have that, it gives you that opening, that door to a better life. Now that migration, you don't s- you start to see a lot of that in that same time period in the 1840s because you have the Oregon California Trail, and you have what starts out as just a few hundred immigrants turns into thousands and thousands, and this is going to lead to a conflict with the indigenous peoples that are living on the plains. And then you have the gold rush, the discovery in 1848, and that brings thousands and thousands either across the plains or around the Horn. In a way, this idea of manifest destiny again is not only is it a justification for these people at that time, but it seems to be that it's being fulfilled to them as well. I mean, look, this idea of expanding, and all of a sudden we discovered gold, and there's these rich lands in Oregon and in the Northwest, and so it's this massive movement, and everybody that's going thinks it's going to be better. They think they're going to strike it rich. They think they're going to be rich landholders. I mean, everybody that goes there thinks that life is going to be better at the other end of that trail.
One could say that this destiny of coast to coast was sort of manifesting itself as we
In
see,
a
but
way, yes. Oh,
that's
yeah.
interesting that you say sort of a justification. Um, do you think propaganda plays a role in that? Was this idea of manifest destiny a form of propaganda?
I think it could be. You could look at it as propaganda, but I think what's interesting to me um, is that it wasn't just something that politicians espoused and talked about. I mean, there were popular songs of the day that had this phrase that we are bound to expand to the Pacific coast. So it was the common folk that latched onto that. It wasn't just something that was talking about theoretically, or like I say, in the halls of Congress. I mean, the common folk latched onto that and believed that God had destined them to expand, just like they believe that God felt in their eyes that the American Indians weren't properly using the lands that they were living on, and that it would be better for Euro Americans to harvest their crops on these places where once they had their villages and once they hunted the buffalo. It's like it's just kind of it would be like us today, going to a Colorado and going down to Texas and saying, those oil wells, you're not really using them the way they ought to be used, and I think we're just going to take them. So kind of the same idea.
That's funny. but also kind of barbaric and unfortunate. Um,
Exactly, yes.
that's funny you say that about manifest destiny. This wasn't just sort of a political slogan. It was an idea that gripped the heart of every American. It was a promise of a better life. When we speaking about the American dream and this idea that the West represented new freedoms was, I mean, my romantic view of America and the American dream is, anybody can make it anywhere in America. Was what was the circumstances in the already established areas? Was the American dream limited to them, as opposed to, the frontier?
Well, I think that, this idea, of going west, um, even if people weren't able to, or let's say they were afraid to, or their circumstances, they just didn't have the money to go west. They still had this idea that they could, that it was, the fact that the West existed, um, that was something that was positive for them, that it was there and that it was part of the United States. And it also, I think, leads to, um, how the West and the popular imagination spawns all kinds of books and eventually, what we would call dime novels, pulp novels. People in the East were fascinated by these early publications, whether it was, an account of a trapper or a mountain man, Kit Carson. This is where some of our first, American heroes, or I should say Euro American heroes, come from, is this same period. Fremont was a hugely popular figure in the 1840s because he was doing his exploring and he was publishing his accounts, and these were government documents, but people were reading them for entertainment and to learn about this far country that maybe they would never see, but it was out there. There was this potential, for this young United States, and what was happening there was, often in the newspapers and on people's minds, and you could experience it vicariously by reading Fremont's reports and reading about the native tribes that were there and the struggles that Fremont had. Um, so, uh, so yeah, it's kind of pervasive. The American West, really, in the 1840s, and I'm talking, and of course, this is the Trans Mississippi West because there was a West before the Trans Mississippi West. But this American West in the 1840s, really, again, it's the West of the imagination as well as a physical West.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Just the power of imagination. But that sort of circles back to the propaganda I mentioned earlier with those dime novels. I'm sure because the government was incentivized for people to move west. They wanted people to move west. So I think that may have played a small part in it. But the reason I asked that question, sort of about the dichotomy of the American dream between the West and, say, the East Coast, was, I mean, the Industrial Revolution is sort of dawning at this point, and you have the rise of factory life and tough conditions, tough working conditions, especially in the mines too, like in Pennsylvania, even though a lot of people would end up working in mines out west anyway. But what was the Industrial Revolution also a driving factor in that, and the harsh conditions of factory life?
Well, maybe. The thing is that, uh, as I mentioned before, some of these people may not have had the capability or the finances to make that move. I mean, and I haven't studied, the coal mining in the 1840s or industrial life to very much of an extent. Like for instance, the cotton mills and on the East Coast and Massachusetts. Um, but they weren't making a very good wage, and so for a lot of these low level workers, um, it just was a dream. It couldn't be beyond that. I mean, you really had to have some help financially to have a wagon. You got to buy a team, whether it's oxen or mules. Those are expensive. You got to have money for supplies. So not just everybody could do that. And so if you did have a farm like in Indiana or Illinois, or Iowa, like, White Earp's family, Nicholas Earp had enough money to where he could take his family, with a wagon train to California. But not everybody was in that situation. So if you were stuck in a textile mill in Massachusetts, probably chances are you're not going to be able to afford to go out there. Unless you're going with somebody else, or someone hired you as a servant or something to go and accompany them to California or Oregon. So, like I said, it for many people it's just a dream. It's not a reality, but it was a very powerful dream.
Yeah. Dreams play a very powerful role in society and the power of imagination. But we've sort of touched on the motivation of survival and freedom. Were there other motivations to move west as well? Sort of the more nefarious players, uh, motivations of ambition or greed.
I'll tell you a story about George Frederick Ruxton. Was an Englishman who went west in 1846 and 1847. Apparently, he was also an intelligence officer for the British government. So he's kind of making observations during this period of the U.S. Mexican War. He's also exploring. He's hunting as well. He's fairly well off. Um, but he arrives at a place in 1847. It's a little trading post on the Arkansas River called El Pueblo, and it's currently Pueblo, the town of Pueblo, Colorado. Well, in that trading post, he said there was an African American who played the fiddle, and he discusses this man at length, and he names the different tunes that he played on his fiddle, and he says that he claimed that he had been captured by, I believe it was the Comanches, and he had escaped them and made his way west. But probably what happened was that he was escaping slavery. So if you're an African American going west, finding some free territory, escaping your master might be a motivation. If you were a criminal, leaving the state or territory or wherever you're in could be a motivation for going west. Um, uh, and also some people went west to escape debt, and that was something that the Earp family, Nicholas Earp, he abandoned Illinois and went to Iowa and left behind, some legal fines that he had incurred for selling liquor in the town. So, yeah, if you owed a bunch of money and you were in debt to a merchant in a certain town, well, you packed up your goods and you moved on. And some folks did that several times as well. So, yeah, I mean, you could say that certainly there were some nefarious characters, but there also another group that went west. Of course, we talked about the California Gold Rush. Well, there was a whole group of individuals, entrepreneurs, who weren't so much interested in finding gold as they were in mining the riches of those who found the gold. So you have shopkeepers setting up in these camps, and for a certain amount of gold dust, you're going to get flour, you're going to get coffee, supplies, wash pans, or what have you. And to me, that seemed like it was a more secure occupation economically because not everybody struck it rich. In fact, very few did. So you have all these entrepreneurs who are making money off of these movements, whether it's the gold rush or at the military forts, there was usually a town established just outside the military reservation where you could get liquor, where there was prostitution, and they're making money off the soldiers because they can't find those things on within the military reservation itself. Yeah, I mean, there's all different types of people, and there's all different ways of making money. I guess making money is a big motivation for people. A lot of the people that were going west in the 19th century.
Yeah, there's so many lenses you could view the Wild West with. This being more of an economic lens. I mean, that's interesting. You have sort of the entrepreneurs that aren't necessarily going to get strike gold, but they're looking to exploit that movement and take advantage of that. The one that comes to mind that you didn't mention is Levi Strauss. I think his last name is Strauss, but I mean, the inventor of Levi jeans, which are still part of culture today. He invents these jeans that hold up to the conditions of mining that the miners loved, and he he was quite successful.
Yeah, well, and then you've got people in the East who are making money off of Westerners. So John B. Stetson, he apparently came out to Colorado during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. He goes back to Pennsylvania and he establishes a hat company, and he continues to make hats for Westerners, but in Pennsylvania. You can say the same thing for the firearms companies, whether it's Colt or Winchester. Those factories aren't in the West; they're in the East, in New Haven, Connecticut. But they're supplying these Westerners with the latest technology of weaponry. So everybody made money off the West, really across the country. Um, and then of course you have the traders who are trading with the Lakotas, the Cheyennes, the Kiowas, and that's a huge industry as well. And the thing is, it's like uh, for a while there was this um, there was this kind of equilibrium between um, the Indians and the traders. They were getting what they wanted. The traders, as I write in one of my books, they were getting the robes and furs, but the traders didn't want their land. So it was for a while a happy relationship, but eventually you have the Euro Americans that not only want what the land produces, but they want the land itself, and that's where we have the big conflict. But Sitting Bull, he never signed a treaty, but whenever he discussed terms, he says all we want is our own place to live, and we want traders. He wanted to make sure that they had people to trade with because once they become accustomed to copper kettles, lead bullets, firearms, sewing awls, even wool blankets. A wool blanket's a lot lighter than a buffalo robe, easier to pack. They wanted to continue that, but it's like so many things. Once that door is opened, it's really hard to close.
Pandora's box. Yeah, that's a great point. I could do a whole episode about sort of the economy and the economics of the Wild West. That's so interesting, the entrepreneurial spirit. And speaking of the entrepreneurial spirit, there's also the pioneering spirit. I mean, what do you think? What role do you think this all plays in the spirit of the American people and the legacy that has in our evolution and our history as Americans? Obviously, we as Americans, we are very independent, pioneering people. We declare our independence from Great Britain. We win a war, and I think that sort of sets the stage for the character of the American people. And I think we see an evolution of that during this westward expansion, and that we are how to it's so hard to put this into words, the ideas that I have in my head about this. Um, but I mean, we are that pioneering people, the trailblazers. What role does the Wild West and westward expansion play in the legacy of the American spirit that still permeates us today?
Well, I think. Did you ever read any of the books by Laurel Ingalls Wilder?
I did not.
Are you familiar with Laura Ingalls Wilder?
No, I'm not. Please enlighten me.
Okay, well, Laura Ingalls Wilder, she wrote a series of books about her childhood, and they're called the Little House books. So, Little House on the Prairie is one of those books, and it spawned a TV show with Michael Landon, which was hugely popular. Um, but anyway, those books were amazingly popular. They're still very popular today. There's a whole series of them. But I bring that up because uh, those books, when they came out, really struck a chord, and it was nostalgia, and it ties right into what you're saying about how the pioneering spirit is reflected and how it's still relevant today. The fact that people continue to read those books and enjoy it. I mean, it's about her father, Pa, and their little family, and they're going west, and they live in a sod house, and they're trying to survive, out on the Great Plains, and uh, and people, again, it was just this nostalgic moment that people latched onto, but it's a reflection of this what you say, the pioneering spirit, and in reality that life was very, very hard. I mean, whether it's hailstorms, fires, crops that are ruined, drought, what have you, but but the way people look back on that experience, with that, those coated lenses, um, it just tells me how much people, that pioneering spirit resonates with people today, and they like, again, it's a nostalgic view, but it's a very significant one, and it's still, as I said, it still resonates and kind of touches on what you brought up.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And you bring up a great point about hardship. That's another part of the American spirit is our ability to handle and overcome adversity and to innovate and adapt. What did you say the book series was called? Because that actually does sound
It's the Little House series, and
the
it's by
Little House
Laura
series.
Ingalls Wilder.
Okay.
And yeah, you should,
I'm definitely gonna look that up.
definitely take a look at them. And you can go on YouTube and you can see parts of the series or whatever. The series is even more romanticized than the books themselves. But it was a hit show for several years. But again, it's I mean, it's a hit because people were fascinated by the West and this pioneer experience, this frontier experience, and how people meet the challenges in the West. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really a cultural phenomenon. And there's a Laurel Ingalls Wilder Museum in Marshfield, Missouri, in southern Missouri, and there's people, and I will tell you, Jake, it's kind of more a girl thing than a guy thing. Um, maybe boys are reading Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, and girls are latching on to Little House on the Prairie. Little House. Well, I guess one's Little House in the Woods or whatever. There's a whole series of them that she wrote, but they were based on her memories. I mean, this was her family that she wrote about.
Wow. That's amazing. I think it becomes so prevalent because it does strike a chord of truth in the heart of man. I mean, sort of the memes we see today, they're funny and they're relatable and they go viral because there's an element of truth to them, not just, this romantic ideal. Um, but yeah, along my intellectual journey, I'll say is grappling with the ideas and being able to articulate them. I think that's sort of the main objective of me is I have, these beliefs and these ideas, and that's what I love about this podcast is it helps me develop those ideas and be able to articulate them.